Welcome to Washington State Wire's virtual conversation with some of Washington State's most thoughtful policy leaders. And now your host, DJ Wilson.
Hello and welcome to another one of our virtual conversations here at the Washington State Wire. My name is DJ Wilson, one of the hosts here, bringing you these conversations and our content covering the politics, the policies, and of course the personalities of Washington State. So thanks for making time to be with us, and thank you to, of course, our guests who we will introduce here in a second. I also want to say thank you to TVW, one of our media partners who's showing this, of course, on their channel across the great state of Washington. So without further ado, we want to jump right in to introduce our guests who are with us today. We have the head of the Republican caucus in the Senate, Senator Braun, Senator Shelly Short, the Republican floor leader for the Republican caucus in the Senate, Representative J.T. Wilcox, House Republican leader for the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives, and his colleague, Representative Jacquelin Maycumber, Republican floor leader for the State House. I try to just read that and not screw it up, and I still screw it up no matter what I do. So thank you for being with us. I appreciate it. So Senator Braun, let's just start with this question about the session, how it went, your reflections on it now that we have a little bit of distance from the session. How do you think it went? What do you list as sort of big wins and big work left to be done?
Anytime you ask a minority leader how a session like this went, you're going to get somewhat negative response. I don't think it went well for the people of the state of Washington for a number of reasons, from a budget that is overspends and doesn't focus on the right things, but does a few good things that were wins for us. And I'll mention a few of those that I think Republicans led on. The Working Families Tax Credit was pushed forward by the House and the Senate Republicans. I think that's a big win for us, and more importantly for the state of Washington, for the folks that qualify for that. Forest Health, bipartisan effort really led by the Republicans, and a couple ones that didn't get quite as much attention. The funding for the developmentally disabled wait list. That was entirely pushed forward by the Senate Republican budgets and the House Republican budget. And then one that's really deep in the weeds, but I always like to mention, every budget writer likes this one, and that's the pay down, $800 million of pay down of the pension liability. That's a big and good financial move. So some good stuff, but overall we overspent, and tons of other things we could talk about. Additional taxes we didn't need. What I think is a wrong direction on the Blake decision. Police reform that went too far. We needed police reform, but went too far in the wrong direction. Carbon, dealing with carbon in a way that's very regressive. And then, of course, one of the favorites is emergency powers and our failure, our complete failure to reform that during the session. So lots of stuff to be frustrated or reflect on and say, hey, we could do better next time. And we'll certainly be back prepared to do better as a majority and basically take the message to the voters of Washington and say, is this really what you want out of your legislature?
Representative Wilcox, what would you count as Republican wins from this session?
Well, I thought that John covered the waterfront pretty effectively there. I was really super proud, honestly, to watch House and Senate budget writers on our side, Drew Stokesbury, just be absolutely fearless in coming out with strong support for the Working Families Tax Credit, and also both caucuses, for the first time in my time in Olympia, bringing out very comprehensive budgets from the minority. Normally for political reasons that isn't done. It gives the other side a lot to shoot at, and if you're going to come out first with a budget, you also are giving up the opportunity to have a little more information, and people can say that it's dated. But I just thought that because we did that, we had a frame of reference for the entire session, and it really allowed us to, I think, have some consistency in our budget debate. I think I would also say that this isn't really a success of the session, but I think it was a success in our ability to talk with our caucus and also talk with the people of Washington, because this session was characterized by progressive rhetoric and utterly regressive action. And because we had a budget first, we knew that we could fund the things that were most important for the state of Washington, including the working families tax credit. And then the second half of the session was characterized by things that in the long run are going to crush people that just want to live in a place that's affordable. And because where you have an affordable housing situation, you usually don't have much of an economy. These people often live in Republican districts and they have to commute a long ways. And the burdens that are being placed on them to accomplish almost nothing, I think are tragic. And we're going to keep talking about those.
I want to jump back into some of the fiscal conversation here in a second, but Representative Maycumber, tell us what you think. How did the logistics go? I think they seemed very daunting back in December as people were doing their first tests. How did it go as a representative of the people, where you had to get a lot of your input via video or text or email?
Well, I'm very concerned that the public is going to find out what the legislature did this year when they start writing checks or start trying to buy groceries or fill up their gas. This year with the Zoom, it was, accessible to give testimony, but it was a little more difficult to really have that one-on-one with your legislator, with the representatives that are making the decisions for every one of us. And so as a floor leader on the House floor and the only one on the House floor, and having only a screen to look at, was very difficult to have that communication back and forth. It's important that the people that are making the decisions in law and making those important decisions for the economy and the people have that one-on-one communication. You can only, get your phone number so many times, but the people really need to have that access. I think you heard many times, especially in the Senate, some people would be testifying for 30 seconds to a minute. That's not enough time to fully express the concerns. They need to have access to the government. And this year, you really see a lot of policies passed that never passed in the past. And you really see the lack of public communication, the public input.
Senator Short, do you think that the logistical nature of this session, where people could not be in the legislative building, couldn't be on campus, generally speaking, do you think that created an opportunity for Democrats to have a more progressive session because there were fewer voices in the building, or was that not relevant, do you think?
Oh, I think it was absolutely relevant. Look, the legislative process took place. It happened. All of the hearings were held. We had our floor actions and all of that. But that's actually a very small part of what happens in session. It is all of the conversations. It's the people protesting, as we walked into the legislative building. I doubt that the hairdressers who descended on the Capitol 2 years ago to protest one of the bills that Senator Kaiser had would have had the same reaction, because they wouldn't have had access to the Capitol. They stopped that bill dead in its tracks. And I think that was the hardest part of session. You could just feel the session was at arm's length, both from people who needed to talk to us or just participate actually in general, but actually with each other as well. I'm not saying that there weren't collegial times or times where there were bipartisan agreements. By and large, Senator Elias and I found ways to work through things on the floor, but there was still this very distant feeling, and I think it absolutely had an impact on where the bills ended up.
So, Representative Wilcox, in terms of fiscal policy, though I know that's Senator Braun's particular area of focus, but in terms of House fiscal policy and ultimately legislative policy, was the capital gains tax something that passed this year because of this sort of lack of the public being able to access? Did that specific bill have more wind in its sails this year because of the dynamics of the COVID legislature?
Well, I thought that last week or two of the session saw an awful lot of bills get through that normally would have no chance at all. In fact, it failed repeatedly. And it's hard not to draw a correlation between that and the fact that we had this odd kind of quantity but not quality public input. And there's another factor as well. I think the press was really shut out. And I've talked to quite a few members of the press. They have had electronic access only. I think there was a couple of days towards the end where they were allowed to wander around. But when you think of, budget negotiations in the past, I remember Melissa Santos talking about doing an interview with a negotiator while she stood in the bushes and talked through an open window at the JLOB briefing room. And, we've got I think a great Capitol press corps. There's not many of them, but they know everybody. And, they do their best work when they're running into somebody walking between buildings or, coming out of a negotiating session where they felt ignored, or coming out of a caucus meeting mad. This was the perfect situation to orchestrate a agenda. And I hope we never go through this again. It's an opportunity to be pretty efficient for the ruling party, and they've had 30 years of almost unbroken, opportunities to do what they want. But this business of being so easily able to orchestrate contact, and there's one other thing too. It's true that you can have, a lot of people on at 30 seconds or 1 minute at a time, and there's no differentiation between people that are gravely impacted by a policy and those who are just advocating but don't have any skin in the game. The other thing that happens when there's no face-to-face is you have the opportunity as a legislator to totally screen out any negative input. Where when you're walking around that building, you're going to have to talk to people that are not happy with you. And I can't think of anything that's more important to legislative success, honesty, and good work in the idea that when you go outside that door, you're going to run into the people that you've made unhappy. That's accountability, and we haven't had that this year.
So, Senator Braun, on the capital gains tax, where does that go from here vis-a-vis the legislature? You talked about campaigning on it. Obviously, the courts will have their say, but how do you continue to sort of grapple with this? Is this a topic that you'll be talking about in your town halls throughout the interim, or give us a sense of how the capital gains will remain a legislative area of focus?
I talk about three ways, and some of them are legislative, some of them maybe not legislative. The one, of course, is there's a lawsuit filed. As you know, two lawsuits they're going to be two lawsuits, and that's going to work its way through the court system, and that's already started. I expect there's going to be an initiative now. The majority party put in language that specifically ruled out the right of the people to have a referendum that could have happened this year. I'm certain would have happened this year, and they did that specifically because they wanted to make sure they had time to get a court opinion, and they're hopeful that a very left-leaning Supreme Court decides after 80 plus years that the Constitution reads differently than everybody's thought up till now. So that's gonna, but so no referendum, but I expect an initiative effort by folks in 2022, and that's gonna, of course, affect our 2022 election cycles. Everybody's gonna be asked to weigh in on that, and then finally, here's the thing: in the Senate, it passed twice, 25 to 24. So every single person that voted for that was the deciding vote. That means as we go back in front of the voters in 2022, and they get to decide, are we representing them in the way they would like? Every single person that voted for that is going to have to explain themselves in the context of, I could have stopped this, and it was close. As you probably already know, passed through the Senate twice. The first time they got 25. The second time we had one person switch back from yes to no, and a person switched from no to yes. I mean, this was all without considerable, as was mentioned earlier, without significant access by the public, by their constituents, to talk to them and weigh in on why this is a bad thing for the state of Washington. So I think there's three fronts on this as we move forward. One is the judicial, the other is the vote of the people that I think will happen at some point in the next year and a half. And then finally, there'll be what does this do to elections in the Senate? I think this is a huge issue because everybody that voted yes for it personally could have stopped it.
So Representative Maycumber, if the capital gains tax was an effort, according to Democrats in the legislature, to address regressivity of the Washington State tax code, the Working Families Tax Credit is a big effort to address regressivity in the Washington State tax code, as well as Representative Wilcox mentioned. I believe this is an idea that comes first from Representative McEwen and certainly the House or the Republicans in the legislature. Well, talk about what that advocacy effort was like to try to give voice to working families and make sure that that was funded after a number of years of being maybe on the books but not getting funded.
Absolutely. Representative Stokesbury has been a huge advocate, of investing in people, not government, and really looking at where you put that money and then how that money is used. And the Working Family Tax Credit really embodies that idea that, hey, let's start investing in the people of Washington State, not the bureaucracy of Washington State. And we've shown many, many times that investing in the bureaucracy of Washington State is not very successful. I mean, we put billions of dollars into homelessness, and we've had a crisis, even more with the amount of money. We look at these groups and these issues that we have. When we invest in the people, you see that they're built up. And so Representative Stokesbury, Representative McEwen, they were really big advocates and understanding why this is very important right now. But talking about the capital gains income tax, one, it's unconstitutional. But two, it really, you have this, look at this hand, and then at the same time, the governor's putting in his own budget that he wants 9% at $25,000. You really need to talk about the facts. And the facts are, if this passes, your own governor in the state of Washington wants to bring down the income tax to the people who could afford it the least. So it's really shocking to have this conversation, talk about investing in people. And at the same time, when we have the highest number of revenue, we've got billions in CARES Act dollars. Now we're talking about really taxing the people that can afford it the least, the most. And so regressive. This is an issue. And the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans really talked about investing in the people. You saw our House budget written by Representative Stokesbury really showed that investing in the people, investing in small business owners, investing in the people that build the state budget up, and making sure they are strong, especially through this post-COVID economy, is so important.
Thank you for politely correcting me. Representative Stokesbury would want that credit. Senator Short, just tell me give people who are not in the caucus chambers with you all a sense of how Republicans view this question of regressivity in general in Washington State, because it becomes almost in some cases, it becomes kind of this like symbolic wedge issue between left and right. But I think Republicans have clearly shown in this instance and in others a willingness to engage on the topic constructively. So break down sort of what the public might think about left versus right on this. How do Republicans think about regressivity in the tax code?
Well, I think certainly we need to make sure that our job creators stay strong. I know that there's a lot that the other side likes to claim. They don't pay their fair share and things of that nature. I think whatever we put together, we have to keep our job creators strong and address where there are challenges. But look, you don't tap into addressing the regressive nature of our tax code by just passing a capital gains income tax. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's not like they did it as a net wash, if you will. We're going to raise it over here, but we're going to reduce it over here. There was no reduction. There was no reduction at all. And actually, we did the Working Families Tax Credit, which we're all really proud of. But then on one hand, the system does that, and then on the other hand, they take it away. You're going to increase the cost of our gasoline through low carbon fuel standard and the climate change bills. You're going to increase the cost of food, electricity, maybe penalize a person who has an older car that needs to drive greater distance from home to work. And they're going to be paying the lion's share of that. And so I think if we're going to address regressivity, it's got to be the policies that we pass to make it so as well, along with the tax code. So I look forward to those conversations.
So Representative Maycumber, I wonder if you can give just give us some context of how this session felt compared to other sessions vis-a-vis bipartisanship. Very progressive session, at least by my observation, but it was a very bipartisan session as well. And I think, listening to Representative Wilcox and Senator Braun in their press conferences, they made an effort, the caucuses made an effort to be bipartisan. How does the nature of bipartisanship in this session compare to other sessions?
Well, the difficulty with this session is that the idea of group thought, you only hear the people around you, and that really affects how you represent the people of Washington State. I was lucky enough to be one of the handful of people that were in the Capitol with Representative Wilcox and Braun and Shelly Short. And it's really important to, hear different ideas, hear different people. And when you're at home in Zoom, you really saw, as you mentioned, those ideas continue to percolate because you're around the same group over and over again. And that causes that group thought idea, right? That you're reinforcing those ideas. It's so difficult to reach over the aisle unless you're talking on a phone, because you don't get the Zoom calls very often. It was a little more difficult to get a hold of the other side to really talk those ideas out. A lot of those conversations occur in the hallway in the legislature. This year, we had to get some bills passed, and we had to have those conversations and really work for the betterment of the people of Washington State. And you're even seeing a lot of this bipartisanship now, and I'm sure you're going to ask those questions about the governor's emergency powers and some of his veto ideas. And those are bipartisan ideas. Those are for the ideas for the people of the state of Washington. Those are issues that are affecting them now. And so those are really important, that you have that conversation with somebody that doesn't always just believe what you believe in your circle. So it's really important that we do get together in the next biennium or soon to have these conversations.
I am going to ask about those vetoes here in just a second. I want to make sure that our audience members know that they can pose questions, as I see a couple of them already up on the board here. Of course, you can upvote those, and that will let me know which to prioritize in terms of our questions to integrate into the conversation. Representative Wilcox, let me ask you just to follow up on that question about bipartisanship. Sometimes people argue that if you want to win elections, you gotta pick fights, and that you have to throw tantrums to get media attention, so to amplify the differences. And that did not seem to be, and you, as I mentioned, and Senator Braun spoke to your bipartisan approach this year, that did not seem to be the strategy. How are some of your caucus members, or some of those voices who are like, hey, we need to call out stark differences and we need to amplify those? How did you bring everybody along so that this could be as bipartisan as possible?
Well, first, let me say something about bipartisan. I don't think this was at all a bipartisan session. On the contrary, it was extremely partisan. But that doesn't mean that we have to behave in a way that burns bridges and makes it impossible to take advantage of whatever agreement there is. I guess one principle that I have is I just despise demonizing people. Demonizing people and groups, and I won't demonize. And so maybe that comes through. I'm glad if it does, but there are some stark differences. You've heard us talk about them here. And I think John and I and others are determined to continue to expose these differences, especially when the impact of the things that were done in this session is so at odds with all of the progressive rhetoric. That makes me angry, as a matter of fact. Along with this idea that I'm not going to demonize, and we're not going to give up and give in, goes the idea that you try to maintain as much of a cordial working relationship as you possibly can, because a lot of times these things are not personal. There's not hatred or animus involved. There's very, very different political viewpoints and different life experiences that go on. But I know that John and his counterpart meet regularly, just informally on the floor, and we couldn't do that in the House. But Speaker Jenkins, she and I just call each other Lori and JT. We don't require a week's worth of appointments to go and talk to each other. We're both pretty good at wandering across the chamber and knocking on the door and seeing if there's an opportunity for 5 minutes to visit and deal with some problem that might be making it hard to conduct business.
So, Senator Braun, I remember a conversation we hosted with you back in September that included, I believe it was September, may have been actually at Rewire in December, that included also Senator Rolfes, and the topic of emergency powers came up then, and my recollection was that Senator Christine Rolfes, Democratic member and chief budget writer for Senate Democrats, my recollection is that she said there will be a conversation about emergency powers. That conversation must have been mostly behind the scenes. Why, given all of, I don't want you to speak for Democrats, but when there was so much concern among senior legislators about the emergency powers of the governor, why did that not break out into the open more prominently?
Yeah, that's a great question. I genuinely wish I had a better answer for you. It was in December. It was on, and I was very encouraged by Senator Rolfes' comment. And it wasn't the first time she had said something along those lines, that she was frustrated with the governor's kind of one-person rule, and that we needed to reassert the proper role of the legislative branch of our government. But when we got to session, that evaporated. There was no willingness, zero. So I won't even say there was some, quiet, non-public conversations about trying to get after emergency powers. It was pretty much, not willing to go there, not willing to take on the governor, and it was, frankly, to me, disappointing. And we were willing to work on it in a bipartisan way. And I want to reinforce what JT said earlier. I don't want you to confuse our effort to work and find places where we can work on bipartisan issues. And I mentioned some earlier, whether it's forest health or working families tax credit or whatever. That happened, but it was not the regular occurrence in the session. This was strictly by the numbers, by the votes, the most partisan session in at least in recorded history. We tried to be civil, respectful, polite, but you shouldn't confuse that with we agree with what they're doing. We clearly didn't agree because we didn't vote for it. We found places where we could work together, and we did. Where we couldn't work together, we tried to propose better solutions. And frankly, back to your question, emergency powers, that was one we could get. Despite repeated attempts to propose, thoughtful, easy, not easy, but moderate reforms to emergency powers, we could get nobody to bite in the majorities. They just weren't interested in taking on the governor, and I think that's they should. And I'm disappointed in that. So all I can say to that, they should be disappointed too.
Senator Short, I don't know that I perceive this governor to be a stronger governor than others, or weaker. I perceive him to be relatively within the main. That is sort of. I guess I would ask you the same kind of question. What were you hearing from your colleagues, if anything, particularly folks like Senator Mark Elias, whom you spend a lot of time with on the floor? What were you hearing from Democrats about their interest or lack thereof about talking about emergency powers?
I mean, actually, it was stunning, the lack of discussion on the issue. I'll just take you back to the very beginning of session, that the first vote we took on the Senate floor on our Senate rules was to carry forward all of the emergency orders that he's given to the end of the pandemic, whenever he decides that is. That was our first vote, official vote of any kind on the floor, and it was offensive. I mean, it was just stunning. I would advocate and look, I have good friends across the aisle. I work really hard to find solutions. I agree with John and JT. You don't wear it on your sleeve. You know how you get things done is you try to find those solutions, and it's not personal. But it was just stunning that was their first take. And I often would ask them, well, if this had been a Republican governor, would you have the same, would you have had the same response? And they just kind of look away. I think they made up their minds without putting words in their mouth, obviously, DJ, but that they were going to support their governor, and any detraction or diversion away from that wouldn't be seen as that. We brought up emergency powers bills on the floor in ninth orders to try to continue to put pressure on the issue, and it just fell on deaf ears.
So, Representative Wilcox, let's talk a little bit about some of the vetoes that came down this week from the governor. The more contentious ones are always at the end of his signing period. What do you make first of his ability to veto a sentence versus a section or a line? This is a constitutional question that the courts have already decided on, but tell our viewers what's happening here and why you think that's something we're revisiting. If you could, I'm not asking you to read the governor's mind, but it just is such an odd kind of thing.
Well, I think it's stunning to, willfully do something that he lost on in court so recently. And I got a kick out of the strong statements that came out of the House and Senate Democratic leaders. We'd been telling them they needed to stand up for our branch versus the governor, and I think, were happy to have an opportunity. Unfortunately, this is just an argument between Democrats. There's no Republican that had anything to do with any of those bills or the language. And so, this is going to be pretty critical, what I'm going to say. I think clearly they were willing to stand up when it was a fight between Democrats, but when it was a semi-constitutional fight about the relative power of the two branches, nowhere to be seen. Having said that, I'm glad that they have come aggressively out. Again, I've got no clue what the governor is trying to prove, on something that he seems so plainly likely to lose. And then, there was also the one having to do with negotiations with tribes. And that seemed a little gratuitous too. It may be because things are so secret right now, DJ, there's very little transparency. This may all be theater too. I can't believe that the Democrats involved in this were totally surprised either.
This is all sort of inside baseball, but that's kind of the stuff that we love here at The Wire. So let me ask this question that comes from Lucy Fern. She asks about the broadband bills. Senator Short, I'll pose this to you. The broadband bills that were signed by Governor Inslee this week and how they will impact your rural constituents, and whether you think the bills can coexist or whether they cancel each other out. And just as an aside for viewers, our reporter Michael Goldberg has been covering this for going back a month or so, and this is a bill from one bill from Representative Drew Hansen and one bill from Senator Lisa Wellman that have worked in concert, but may have some conflict, and the governor this week signed them both at the same time so that one would not preclude or overwrite the other, which was also odd. What do you think about this question?
Well, the more odd question actually is that apparently the Secretary of State is going to go to the court to determine how to actually proceed forward. Look, there was some language in both bills that quote unquote supposedly made them both work. And I guess it's yet to be seen. Senator Wellman's and my approach was to really focus on unserved communities and those that have, just little to no access to broadband. And we did it in a thoughtful, targeted approach that didn't allow overbuilding of existing services. And Representative Hansen's bill was obviously, just kind of ripping that Band-Aid off and just doing it wide open. And so I hope that the challenge of figuring out if the two can work together don't overshadow the need to get broadband out. But I'd like to give out a shout out to a bill that actually didn't survive because his bill was still very instrumental in how the funding through the capital budget went, and that was Senator Honeyford, Senate Bill 5356. Although his bill didn't pass, it really set a framework, if you will, for how funding, part of the funding was structured in the capital budget. So I think absent how these bills go forward, they're important partners to have, our public entities and our private companies and the state, I think we can figure this out. But in the meantime, there's a lot of money that's gone through the state broadband office, and a lot of that is clearly marked for unserved communities and those partnerships. So I think it's up to us as legislators and people who work with our communities to ensure that these projects happen. But there's certainly a question. Look, at the end of the day, I supported one bill and not the other, because oftentimes we talk about all of the efforts we do, the people who need help the most don't get it. And so my frustration with the House bill was really whether or not these people were going to continue to be forgotten. And that's what I liked about Senator Wellman's approach, was that we really targeted those investments, to people who needed them. So, it's going to stand to be seen if those bills can be integrated together or not.
For the folks who know better than to be deep policy geeks, these two bills may be in conflict, and so Governor Inslee signed them both at the same time, one right hand, one left hand, so that one did not overwrite the other. The newest, most recently signed bill would overwrite the prior bill. Now it goes, as Senator Short has said, to the Secretary of State, who has to enroll these in the revised codes of Washington, and of course she has to number them and order them, so she's asking for guidance from the court. Representative Maycumber, I want to ask you this question from Blair Daly. Blair asks, what are Republicans doing to oppose laws that require the teaching of critical race theory in public institutions? Any thoughts on how this topic has played out in the legislative arena?
This is a very difficult topic. This has been pretty emotional nationwide and how it's affecting a lot of students and people and a lot of communities. You're seeing a lot of schools come out now and saying it hasn't benefited their students, and they're having a lot more difficulty with their students who are enacting this policy. The House Republican caucus came out almost unanimously opposed against this policy. And making sure that we're enacting policies that make everyone feel equal and have successful conversations regarding these emotional topics of race is so important. And unfortunately, a lot of these issues or these topics can be highly emotional and can really make a lot of different people feel less than beneficial with this curriculum. So we've definitely come out opposed. It has passed, and my understanding will be a policy in the state of Washington for secondary, so children in elementary school all the way into college.
Senator Braun, let me ask you about some of the police reform bills that you mentioned early on in your opening comments. Some of those banned things like chokeholds or other dangerous activities. Some did not pass that address things like limiting qualified immunity for police officers. But there was a lot of verve because of the social unrest, because of the murders of black men by the hands of police in places across the country, and of course issues with deaths in places like Tacoma with Manny Diaz. So walk us through how your caucus thought about those police reform bills and how you sort of make heads or tails of this really emotional conversation.
Well, DJ, that's a big question. I'm not sure we have enough time to answer that. Let me just jump in. And I guess I'd preface it with I'm not an expert in these policies, but all of us spent a lot of time understanding the bills as they came up for votes. And I'd focus on a kind of a couple. I mean, there were several bills, but I would categorize them in a couple of groups. One were tactics or tools that police could use, and the other was the certification, decertification, basically the review of the actions of law enforcement officials. And I would say in all cases, Republicans were interested. They thought this is an important topic, obviously at this time in our nation's history, but important nonetheless. We want to make sure that our law enforcement officers are not only doing a good job, but there's processes and law in place to hold them accountable if they behave poorly. And these are human organizations. There are going to be some misbehavior. I don't think it's a lot. But when we see it, it's a big deal, and we want to make sure we can deal with it. There's no disagreement by Republicans that this was an important issue, that we wanted to be involved, that we wanted to see reasonable reform there. There wasn't much interest, frankly, by the majorities, at least from my perspective in the Senate, in our involvement in this. They had very clear ideas. They set up committees ahead of session that didn't involve us, made no real attempt to reach out across party lines, and they therefore came into session with very, my view, and I think the view of our caucus, very one-sided solutions to a real problem. And I think the losers in this will be the citizens of the state of Washington. They absolutely deserve to know that they will be treated fairly and equally by law enforcement officials, regardless of their race, their gender, any other point you want to bring up. But they also want to make sure that law enforcement officials have the tools to keep them, their families, and their communities safe. And I think we swung too far away from that. I think we took legitimate tools away from law enforcement officials to get their job done and keep our communities safe. And my concern is, as a result, we end up with less safe communities, not safer communities, because there was just simply no interest in a middle ground that recognized the need for reform, but also guarded against going too far and doing harm to our state and the communities around our state.
So Representative Wilcox, I think you mentioned on 2 occasions during our talk today the sort of maybe some of the less progressive fiscal policies that were enacted, some of the more regressive things that came out of this legislative session. Capital gains, certainly arguably very progressive. Working families tax credit, arguably very progressive. What are the regressive elements of fiscal policy that have gotten you so fired up?
Okay, well, first let me say something about capital gains. That's progressive only in the sense that it made some people pay more. It did nothing to help people that are less fortunate. So if that's what progressivism is, if it's just let's make some people pay more and forget about everybody else, I don't really see that as being a very positive goal. The thing that I think I and many of my colleagues are the most wound up about are the bills that were signed yesterday. These are 2 bills that deal with climate and carbon, low carbon fuel standards. Most people concede is going to have, essentially no impact on global climate. It is going to be quite expensive. It's only been partially implemented in some states, and we're beginning to see cost impacts there. The dollars don't come to Washington to build infrastructure, to build the economy. They mostly go to producers in other states or even other countries. And cap and tax is somewhat similar. It will have a pretty high impact on the cost of commuting. And what bothers me so much about this, DJ, is these are not wealthy people that are going to be impacted the most. This is taking from the poor and giving to favored groups, to spend these dollars. And the folks that are going to be most impacted are mostly represented by Republicans. These are families that live often considerable distances away from urban areas because that's where housing is affordable. And that's where, they have quality schools. And because of that, people have to commute long distances. I've got people that commute from, East Pierce County to Everett, for crying out loud. That's because they want to live in a place that has affordable housing and they have jobs that are a long ways away. These are the people that are going to be crushed. And the regressive impact of that is so far beyond any of the efforts that have been made to help them, even including the working families tax credit. The impact is nothing but regressive. And I'm not a bit impressed with what was accomplished this session because of that.
I want to get a question to each of you here as we start to get near the end of our time, but I want to ask first one additional question of Senator Braun and Representative Wilcox, which is, as at least what Representative Wilcox knows, I think 2022 is going to potentially be a really big year for Republicans because of redistricting and the way that Washington State draws the maps. And so I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of how you think the redistricting process is going vis-a-vis your caucus. I think that is, I think it's super important, and people don't always appreciate it. So, Senator Braun, any observations so far on how the redistricting process is going?
Well, I think it's been fairly quiet so far. As you may know, we're not going to get the data till much later in the year than we normally do. I think September is now the date we expect to get it. So there's going to be a lot of effort crammed in at the end. That said, we do have preliminary data they've started to work on. I would say, broadly, the cards are less in our favor than they were 10 years ago. Most of the population gain since 2010 has been in the central Puget Sound. That makes, so when you start with that, how you shift districts makes it probably a little more challenging for us. That said, I think our way forward is clear. That we need is, if we want to convince the people of the state of Washington that we have better ideas, we can better represent them and bring better results for them and their families, we need as many competitive districts as possible, so we can go out there and compete in the electoral marketplace with better ideas and better representation. That's what I think we're after. I think that's entirely consistent with the mission of redistricting, that we're looking for districts that can compete on ideas with the people, and that they're not predetermined before we even start the race. So I think broadly slow so far, but I remain optimistic that we can do exactly what I said and bring districts that we can compete in, and then go make our case and convince the people of the state of Washington that the Republicans are better for the long-term good of themselves and their families.
Representative Wilcox, anything to add on how we're drawing the lines this year in Washington State?
Well, I think I learned this from Bruce Chandler last time we went through this. He said you'd never see the impact until the election after the one that you think is impacted by redistricting. I think people take a little time to decide what their alliances are. It's not a bad thing for all of us to have a slightly different district by the time it's all said and done. It's a good, I think, incentive to go out and get to know your district again. And again, I think that if we understand that our mission, in order to be more competitive statewide, is to create as many competitive districts as possible, that's a good thing for the people of Washington. I hope they help us with it.
So I want to ask each of you this question at the end. I'll start with you, Senator Short, and that just is to tell us what gives you hope right now about our political system in Washington State. It's been tumultuous these last number of months, and for a lot of reasons. But as you sit here as a senior member of our citizen legislature, what gives you hope about the state of Washington State politics in May of 2021?
I think the biggest hope that I have are actually that the people are going to share with us whether or not they think we're in the right going in the right direction. The decisions that were made this session, and ultimately they will judge that. And this was a tough session, and I think because of the tough and unique nature of something that we hope should never ever happen again, and shouldn't really, quite frankly, I think people are going to hold their feet to the fire, and they should. And I think they may do it in ways that they've not done before, because of the lack of access, because of the virtual nature. But look, I'm a half glass full type person. I have faith in people. I have faith in us to care about the people we represent. And I don't think you'd do this job if you didn't. It was brutal. I mean, the session was brutal. And in some ways, I feel like the majority party took advantage of the situation by taking on policies that really should have had much more deliberation. But with that said, we will be held accountable, and I look forward to those conversations with people who just want to be independent, they want to get their lives back, they want to show the state of Washington that they're in the best place to make the decisions for their families, for themselves and their communities, and that's what I want to support. I want to see what their ideas are. We know we have work going forward to continue to help our job creators in the state of Washington, rebound from what happened, and families in our communities. So I look forward to those conversations.
Representative Maycumber, what gives you hope as you look out on our politics here in Washington State for 2021?
Well, this has been such an interesting, like you mentioned, progressive session. It really gives me hope that we stop yelling, we start building. Republicans haven't been in charge in my whole generation, my whole life in Washington State. And so you see these ideas continue to build. If we wanted to stop the regressive tax structure, we shouldn't have increased the spending 18% in 2019. 18% spending would have really saved everybody a lot of money. You see a lot of these policies impounding on themselves. You see building costing more money, and so as a response, less housing. You see a lot of the policies they continue to enact really react and create a harder lifestyle in the state of Washington. Now with LCSF, which cuts down the Brazilian rainforest to build sugar beets for the state of Washington, you see the gas tax, you see low carbon cap and tax, you see income tax. These things are going to come to a head. And the state of Washington will have their chance to respond, just as Senator Short said. But it's really important that we have a chance to start building for the people of the state of Washington, invest in the people of the state of Washington, and not the government of the state of Washington, not the bureaucracy. We built the bureaucracy, we built it up, and it's proving not to work right now. So it's time we start investing back into the people. And I do have hope that we will start turning and start building up the people, especially during this post-COVID economy.
Senator Braun, how about you? What gives you hope here in May of 2021 about our politics in Washington State?
Well, I'd repeat something that Shelly Short said: is you don't stay in this business unless you're hopeful and optimistic. Otherwise, it just runs you into the ground. So I try to just be naturally hopeful, but more fundamentally, our system of government, more than anything else, gives me hope. Because guess what? We just got beat up for nearly 4 months, but we get to go out and make our case to the voters over the next year and a half that what would happen in this session and what may happen in 2022 session is bad for them. And whether you're talking about the capital gains income tax and this, frankly, a false narrative about regressivity. Now, none of us want a regressive tax system, but what nobody ever mentions is that from $25,000 a year to $250,000 a year, everybody in that band, and you can imagine the vast majority of Washingtonians are in that band somewhere. They're within just a couple tenths of a percent of the national average on taxes. So this is entirely a canard that most of our voters are suffering from a regressive tax system. It's just not true. So we need to go out and at the same time, they have said, those same voters have said over and over and over again, we don't want an income tax. So the majority just went out and said, hey, we really think you need an income tax and you're suffering from regressivity. We got a chance to go out and explain to them the truth, that they're not suffering from regressivity, most of them, and that they don't want an income tax. And if they don't want to continue down this road, they need to change the folks that represent them. And whether you talk about that or you talk about the cap and trade, cap and tax system that's going to hit, is going to be regressive. It is going to hit folks that can at least afford it, or the low carbon fuel standard, some refer to as the high cost fuel standard, that's going to drive, enormous cost into your gas tank for those who can least afford it. We get the chance to go out and explain this to people. That's a great opportunity, and a reason for hope is when they hear what the current majorities just did to them. I think they're going to be interested in what we have to say. So I'm hopeful that we go out and talk to them and they make different decisions in 2022.
Representative J.T. Wilcox, how about you? What gives you hope?
Well, it's hard to compete with all this hope that we're hearing, but history is cyclical. Everyone thinks it's straight line. That's because within the span of our working career, it's hard to see the cycle, but it absolutely is. We have seen these cycles many times before. I know you've heard me preach about the fact that I'm in this. I think the bedrock belief that I have is that single party government is a disaster for everybody in the long run. It corrupts the party in power because they're never really accountable. The same team is always calling everything. And the truth is, it's really bad for the party out of power, too, because, they get the sense that their rhetoric is never going to have to match up with reality. This whole thing will thrive when people understand that anybody can be in the majority and anybody can be in the minority. And that's not just politicians. I think that's people out there in general, too. There can be nothing that would promote empathy more than understanding that you're not always going to be a winner and you're not always going to be a loser. So I'm hopeful that people will see that. I have a lot of confidence because I do know that history is cyclical, and I think that we're poised for a turn. And we just have to make sure that when that turn happens, we do the right things. We don't let power corrupt us. We make sure that we understand we're here for all the people, not just the right people. And we learn from our experience in the minority. I think one thing that I am very grateful for, I'm hoping to not be grateful for it for a whole lot longer, is feeling powerless, even though you're in a position of supposed responsibility. I've learned a ton from that. But I think I've learned just about everything I'm going to learn from it. So I'm looking for a new experience.
JT Wilcox, the House Republican leader, Senator John Braun, the Senate Republican leader, the inimitable, of course, Representative Jacquelin Maycumber, who's the House floor leader, and also inimitable Senator Shelly Short, Senate floor leader for the Republicans. Thank you all. I appreciate you guys making time to be with us. And thank you very much for being with us during this show and asking questions so we can get those integrated in. Thank you for watching TVW. Appreciate your participation. And of course, we are following Washington State politics, policies, and personalities at WashingtonStateWire.com all the time. Come check us out. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us in this virtual conversation and for your support of our work at Washington State Wire.